Yes, hi again, it's me, Melik Khachiyan. And again, today we will talk about endgames, some mistakes, some common mistakes in endgames. And we'll continue to talk about Rook endgames. Rook endgames, and today's game would be games, very old game, almost, even more than almost 100 years ago, back to 1909, from a very famous tournament in St. Petersburg between two players, Salve and Ben. So situations is very interesting here. So white's turn. I mean, the first impression, the position is dead draw, and obviously not supposed to get any trouble for black to make a draw. But you see how two, again, it's hard for me to say two grandmasters, even by let's say, by privilege of playing in that tournament, by names, they've been called grandmaster. So let's call them masters. White player here, Salve, one pair, Rook F7 check. And first typical mistakes, first mistake came right here. Black response wasn't the right way. King E8. So why it's the wrong way? Because again, I had explained it in my previous sessions. So every time when you're defending, always try to keep your king on the short side. So since D pawn goes to D8, that means the queen side at this point will be short side. That means I have to keep my king on the short side. So right move was here to play king C8. And then simply go down, keep the rook on D file behind the pawn. Or if you have a chance to keep my rook on H file, to make sure still have 3 file difference between my rook and the pawn on D4. So first mistake came here, again, king E8, mistake. Rook H7, well that was pretty much obvious because white tried to cut the king. Rook D3, so far black doing okay. At this point that's the only, not only move, but one of the best moves to defend this position. In fact, another possible way to play was here, Rook A3, and as we all know, after King E5, for instance, we will play Rook A6, we will control 6 rank, and we will get further position and simply making a draw. So I would say actually Rook A3 even better try the Rook D3, but since Rook D3 is not losing, so it's still okay to play here Rook D3. So King A6, Rook E3 check, here. Now we are having another typical situation, Rook C8. Again, logical move, white trying to protect the king from checks, since if I play here D5, it kind of doesn't make any sense. We have always Rook A6 check. That's the idea of playing Rook C8, and now black's turn, and another mistake right here, Rook A6. So why it's a mistake? Again, I had mentioned that in my previous time, again my previous lessons. So I will say, in case we have trouble to reach first field position when your defensive rook cutting the king and the pawn by rank, then you should try to switch and get field position number 2, or the other name is Lasky defense. So you must play here Rook D3, Rook D3, and D5, Rook D1. The only way when you could be in trouble, I'd say the idea of this defense, again, I'm going to remind you, in case of King C6, you play King E7, and both King and Rook defending D6 square, and white doesn't have any progress. So that's the way how it's supposed to be done. Again, in this situation, the only, let's say, stuff to be scared when white does Rook D8. But I had mentioned that to you guys in my, I believe, previous lesson. So I'm going to remind you one more time. That stuff is getting dangerous in case of B and C pawn. D and E pawn is not really like scary, and at this point it's not really important for my king, defensive king, to be exactly on the short side. Well, preferably it's better to have a short side. But even if your king on the wrong side for some reason, even in this case you still have a draw because of rook a1. Remember, 2 files at this point enough for you to make a draw, because the d5 pawn is still too far to be advanced. That's the only reason why you have a chance to defend the position. Again, I'm going to remind you the way how you're supposed to defend. King c7, check here, and king e7. That's the only reason why this position it's drawn, because the pawn endgame it's drawn, and we have no problem. So it's simply draw here. So get back to the game. So black didn't make a move, which is supposed to be done here. I'm sorry, so rook c8. Yeah, they made a mistake here. They didn't play here, as I said, rook e3. They forgot, maybe they didn't know about that stuff, about putting the rook behind the pawn. And they went here, rook a6 check. Now, it's funny. Now it's white's turn to make a mistake. So white played here. They played here rook c6. Which another mistake, because after rook c6, immediately rook a1, d5, and still coming back on d1, getting field position, and again it's a dead draw. Again, there is no improvement. So what's supposed to be done? It's actually, since the rook controls 8th rank already, I play here king d7. That's the better way. And now, the best try for black would be to play rook a5 to control d5 square. That's the best try. And now we have rook c5. We have here discovery check. That's the reason why we need to have a rook on c7, not on c6. And here d5. That's the only way when you have a chance to win a game, because by using the same principle, discovery checks. I mean, if you do rook a6, then rook c6, and now rook a1, it's actually really hard to find it, because it's all pretty much analysis, and this position, this game has been analyzed by many grandmasters, many players afterward. And only later they found the winning move right here. In this case, rook b6, kind of waiting move. It's important to give away the move for black. And now the problem is, basically, I'm coming down on on the first rank from b file to make sure I have some progress. Because at this point, after you keep making me checks, king is here. I have rook b7, and that's the reason why I'm winning the game, because I'm playing king d7, following by d6, and since you have just 2 files between, 2 files between a rook and the pawn, so it's lost. So the white's temporary problem was because the pawn wasn't advanced. That's why it took them a little bit to advance the pawn. But as soon as pawn reach 6th rank, game is over, because there is no way you can actually, make a draw. The only mistake could happen right here if you play not careful d6, for instance. Then it's actually a draw because of king a6 situation, and only because your rook on b7 is too bad, and you have a problem because I'm having always the checks from a7. So we have to be a little bit more careful. And by playing king d7, kicking the king, and an important moment in this endgame is always shouldering the black king. So that's the reason why it's a simple win for white. So in case if you try to play, let's say, rook a7 immediately to control 7 rank, then I have here still here king d7, Actually, I'm sorry, king c7, because king d7 is king e5. Yeah, king c7 is much better, and we have the same problem because after king c7, I think the best try. I would say actually this is. I'm sorry, but this is kind of troll because this is my mistake, guys. Here we have rook a7 check, and it looks like this is very tactical position to make a draw. So the right way here would be to make this tricky move. The right way here will be to play rook c5. It's actually the same principles how we're playing rook d6 in situation with pawn on d7. Same idea, because rook c5, if you make a check, then I play king d7, and you don't have here king e5 move because this is discovery check. The same principle pretty much works when, like I said, pawn on d7, king on d8. I mean, king on d7, pawn on d6, rook on d7 when you play rook d6. Same discover check ideas. So right here we're still winning the game. Like I said, we have a temporary problem here because the white pawn is still not advanced, but by finding the right moves, it's still a win. So in a game, let's back to the game. I think we will talk about situation right here after rook c8. So rook a6 check. White made a mistake by playing rook c6. And now again, what's happening here, another comedy of mistakes. So black went here rook a8. They thought it's important for them to control the 8th rank immediately. I guess they just didn't know, maybe they forgot about the king on the wrong side. So at this point, it's not important for you to control 8th rank, because that's not situation to make a draw. It's actually the only way, since the pawn is not advanced, is to put the king, to put the rook on feudal position. So that means that's the only way to go back on e1 and simply play rook d1. That's the only way to make a draw. So that's it. That's the mistake, last mistake. And after rook a8, white could simply play, let's say, king d7, and I think game is simply over, because same problem. I will simply step by step move my pawn d to the queen. But again, white made another mistake, rook c7 check, and finally after king e8, now it's a dead draw, because somehow black reached original Philidor position after rook c7, back on d8. And we have dead draw situations, and in a few moves, pretty much game has been ended as a draw. I'll just show you a few moves. Doesn't really matter. So again, see how many mistakes have been made in this game. The both players being very well known players around the world. Been playing at pretty much one of the most prestigious tournament at the time, back to beginning of the 19th century. 20th century. I'm sorry, 20th century. It's like today's Linares. They didn't know the situations. They didn't know the right way how to handle this endgame. So again, let me try to summarize the situation. Even with the basic endgame, rook and pawn versus rook, which seems to you guys very simple. In fact, having many of these tricks and many of these details. And to summarize, we have to understand this way: if we cannot get a regional Philidor position when defensive rook cutting the rank, typically the 6th rank, then always make sure you're going to get the second Philidor position by putting your rook behind the pawn. Okay, that's another important position for you to understand. Putting your rook behind the pawn, you guarantee pretty much for you another way to make a draw. Only make sure to get better results, to get always better results, try to keep your king on the short side from the pawn. In case if your king somehow located on the long side, well, hopefully at that point you will deal with a center pawn, because if your king will locate it on the long side and you are dealing against a bishop pawn or knight pawn, well, knight pawns actually it's impossible to get to your king on the short side. But let's say against a bishop pawn, if you somehow your king on the long side, then you actually lost, because the example which I introduced in my lesson number 2. So I hope you understood. I hope you figured out the formula, and we will still talk about more endgames in our next lessons. Well, thank you, and I'll see you next time. Bye.